All right, let's jump into this deep dive on government intervention in economics,
Hmm.
using all those sources you sent over
Mm.
to really get into like how governments try to, you know, mess with the markets
Yeah.
using things like, oh gosh, what were some of those things? Sugar taxes,
Yeah.
rent control.
Yeah, some big ones.
Those always seem to be in the news.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we're not just looking at like theory, right? We're going to see what actually happens,
Yeah.
like when these things get put into practice.
Yeah. So you sent over a bunch of articles, research papers, I think even some of your own notes on this.
Yeah.
And it seems like governments have a whole toolbox like taxes,
Uh-huh.
subsidies, price ceilings, and floors,
Right,
right?
right.
Gosh, where do we even begin?
Well, I think it's helpful to think about each of those tools as like addressing something specific, right?
All right.
So, take indirect taxes.
Okay.
These are often used to discourage people from buying things that are maybe considered harmful,
Uh,
like sugary drinks.
like the UK's sugar tax. That's a big one. I mean, did that actually work? Did
Yeah.
people actually change what they were drinking or
It seems like it, yeah.
really?
There were studies that showed a pretty noticeable drop in how much sugar was in soft drinks
Wow.
after they put that tax in.
So it wasn't just like people switching to diet.
No, it seems
Sorry,
like
more sorry.
producers actually like changed their recipes.
Wow, to avoid the tax.
Yeah, probably to avoid those higher tax brackets.
So the tax kind of pushed companies to make their drinks healthier.
It did, yeah.
I wonder if it like pushed them to be more creative.
Yeah,
Do we see a bunch more like new low sugar drinks come out or?
that's a good question. And that's something to think about, right?
Yeah.
Maybe this tax accidentally made the drink industry
Right.
like come up with new stuff.
More innovative.
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So we've got taxes that kind of discourage things. And then what about subsidies? Those kind of go the other way, right?
Yeah, they're the opposite.
They try to get people to buy more of something.
Yeah, exactly.
Usually something that's considered good for society.
Yeah, things that we want more of, right? Like
Okay.
renewable energy
Okay.
or maybe
Well,
education.
So it's kind of like the government saying, hey, we want more of this, so we're going to make it cheaper for you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And what's a good example of that?
Well, in the UK, there's the EV grant scheme.
Oh, yeah. For electric cars.
Right. And that's been really helpful in getting people to buy electric vehicles.
Okay. But is that just helping the people who buy the cars or is there a bigger impact?
Yeah.
Like, does that help,
It probably has a ripple effect, right?
Okay.
Because if more people are buying electric cars,
Mm-hmm.
then companies are going to want to invest more in that technology.
Right.
Maybe we'll see better batteries,
Better charging stations, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Interesting. So those grants kind of help the whole industry.
Yeah. They make it a better environment for those businesses.
Okay, cool. All right. So we've got these taxes and subsidies, which are kind of like the carrot and the stick, right?
Yeah, you could say that.
But what about price ceilings and floors? Those are like directly messing with the price, aren't they?
Yeah, but they do it with a goal in mind, right? So price ceilings,
Okay.
the goal there is to make things more affordable.
Yeah.
The essential things that everybody needs,
Cool.
like housing or food.
Oh, so like rent control.
Yeah.
Didn't that not work so well in Berlin?
You're right. That's a good example of when it doesn't work
Yeah.
because they wanted to protect renters from high rent.
Right.
But it actually made it harder to find an apartment.
Really?
Yeah, because landlords didn't want to rent them out.
Wow. So they were trying to make housing more affordable and they made it harder to find a place.
Yeah, sometimes these things backfire.
That's crazy. Okay, so if a price ceiling sets the highest price, then a price floor sets the lowest price.
Exactly.
Okay, and why would you do that?
Well, usually it's to help out producers or workers, like the minimum wage.
Right, so you can't pay people less than a certain amount.
Exactly.
But doesn't that make it more expensive to hire people?
Yeah, it can, and that can lead to fewer jobs.
Really? So you're trying to help workers, but you might end up hurting them.
Yeah, it's a tough balance.
Wow. Okay, so it's like there's always a trade-off with these things.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, so we've got taxes, subsidies, price controls. What about state provision? What is that?
So that's when the government actually provides the good or service.
Like what?
Well, healthcare is a big one.
Well, like the NHS.
Exactly.
Okay, so the government just runs it themselves,
Yeah, they make sure everyone has access.
but that must be really expensive
Yeah, it can be.
and complicated,
Uh-huh. And sometimes it can be slow.
like lots of bureaucracy.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like weighing the good of having those services for everyone
Yeah.
with the cost and the potential downsides.
Exactly.
Wow, okay, so we also have regulations. Doesn't the government regulate a lot of stuff?
They do, yeah. Regulations are all about setting rules
All right.
to make sure things are fair and safe.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, environmental regulations to reduce pollution,
Okay.
or consumer protection laws
Right, right.
to stop companies from like tricking people,
Yeah, yeah.
things like that.
But how do they enforce all those
Yeah,
regulations?
that can be a challenge.
Right. I mean,
You got to have people checking to make sure companies are following the rules,
yeah.
and you got to have punishments if they don't.
It's like a constant battle.
Yeah, it can be.
Okay, there's one last thing on our list that I don't really understand. Tradable pollution permits. What are those?
So those are kind of interesting.
Okay.
So basically, the government decides how much pollution is allowed in total,
Okay.
and then they give companies permits
Uh-huh.
to pollute up to a certain amount.
So it's like a permission slip to pollute.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, but what if a company wants to pollute more than their permit allows?
Well, that's the interesting part. They can buy permits from other companies.
Oh, so there's like a market for pollution permits.
Exactly.
And that encourages companies to pollute less so they can sell their permits.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow. So it's like making it financially beneficial to be green?
Yeah,
You could say that.
that's actually really clever. Okay.
Right.
But there must be some problems with that too, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, how do you decide how much pollution is allowed in the first place?
Right, right.
If you set the limit too high, it won't really help.
But if it's too low,
It could hurt the economy.
that balancing act again.
Yeah.
Okay, what about making sure the permits are distributed fairly?
Right. You don't want to give some companies an advantage.
Yeah, okay, so we've gone over all these different tools, taxes, subsidies, price controls, all of that.
Yeah.
Is there any one that's like the best? The most effective?
That's the question everyone wants to know.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's no easy answer. It really depends
On what?
on the specific situation.
Like, what are you trying to achieve? What are the potential downsides?
So it's like choosing the right tool from the toolbox.
Exactly. You got to think about the context.
Okay, so there's no magic bullet.
Not really, no.
It's about making choices and understanding the consequences.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So now that we've got all these tools laid out, what about when they go wrong?
Ah, yes. Government failure.
What exactly does that mean?
It's basically when the government tries to fix something, but it makes it worse.
Oh, so it backfires.
Yeah, you could say that.
So how does that happen? What are the main reasons for that?
Well, one big one is price signals.
Price signals.
Yeah, so prices tell us a lot about supply and demand.
Okay.
Like if the price of something goes up, it means people want it.
Right.
And that tells companies to make more of it.
Okay.
But when the government interferes, it can mess with those signals.
How so?
Well, take minimum wage, for example.
Okay.
It's supposed to help workers. But if it's set too high, companies might not be able to afford to hire as many people.
So it could actually lead to fewer jobs.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow, that's not good. So you're trying to help and you end up hurting.
It can happen, yeah.
That's crazy. Okay, so messing with price signals is one way things can go wrong. What else?
Well, unintended consequences are a big one.
Oh, right. Like the rent control in Berlin.
Exactly. They were trying to help renters, but it made things worse.
Yeah, because fewer apartments were available.
Exactly.
Okay, so messing with prices and unintended consequences, what else can go wrong?
Well, running these programs can get really expensive.
Ah, so like administrative costs?
Exactly.
Okay, and those costs can sometimes be bigger than the benefits?
Yeah, that can happen.
So it's not just about the intention, it's also about the practicalities of actually making it work.
Yeah.
What about information? Doesn't the government need good information to make good decisions?
Absolutely. If they don't have all the facts, things can go wrong.
So information gaps can lead to government failure.
Yeah, they can.
Can you give me an example?
Well, take renewable energy subsidies.
Okay.
The idea is to encourage clean energy, right?
Uh-huh.
But if the government doesn't really understand the technology,
Okay.
they might end up subsidizing something that's not ready.
So they're pushing a solution that's not quite there yet.
Exactly.
And that could create a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, it can definitely backfire.
So the government needs to really do their research.
Yeah, and be realistic about the challenges.
Okay, so we've talked about all these reasons why government intervention can fail,
Mm-hmm.
but how do we actually measure that failure?
Well, there's a concept called dead weight loss.
Dead weight loss.
Yeah, it's basically a way to measure how much efficiency is lost
Oh, wait.
because of the intervention.
So it's like a measure of how much worse off we are because of the government messing with things.
Yeah, you could say that.
And can we see that on a supply and demand graph?
Yeah, you can actually see it as like a triangle.
A triangle of lost potential. Okay, so we can actually visualize this dead weight loss.
Yeah. It's a good way to see the impact of the intervention.
Okay, cool. Now, can you give me some real-world examples of government failure? You know, just to really drive home the point.
Sure, well, the EU's Common Agricultural Policy is a classic example.
What's wrong with that?
Well, it's been criticized for creating too much food.
Too much food.
Yeah, and that leads to all sorts of problems.
Like what?
Well, waste, for one thing,
Okay.
and it can also distort the market.
So it's not as efficient as it could be.
Exactly.
Okay, what's another example?
Well, the UK fuel duty is another one.
Oh, yeah, that's the tax on fuel.
Right, and while the idea is to reduce emissions,
Yeah.
it can actually hit poor people harder.
Really? Why is that?
Well, because they spend a bigger portion of their income on fuel.
So it's like a regressive tax.
Exactly.
Okay, so these are real-world examples of how government intervention can go wrong,
Yeah,
even with the best intentions.
exactly.
Okay, so before we move on to the next part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we're all clear on some of the terms we're using.
Sure.
We've been throwing around terms like market failure and externalities.
Yeah,
Could we just take a minute to define those?
sure. So market failure is basically when the market doesn't work the way it's supposed to.
Okay,
Like it doesn't allocate resources efficiently.
so the invisible hand isn't doing its job.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about externalities?
So externalities are basically costs or benefits that affect people who aren't directly involved in the transaction.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure, like pollution from a factory.
Okay,
That affects the whole community, not just the factory owner.
right, so that's a negative externality.
Exactly.
Okay, what about a positive externality?
Well, vaccinations are a good example
How so?
because when you get vaccinated, you're not just protecting yourself,
Uh-huh.
you're also protecting others.
Oh, right, because you're less likely to spread the disease.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like recognizing that our actions have consequences for other people.
Yeah, even if they're not directly involved.
Okay, cool. Now, can we just do a quick recap of those intervention methods we talked about, just to make sure we're all on the same page?
Sure, so we talked about indirect taxes.
Like the sugar tax.
Exactly, and those are meant to discourage consumption.
Okay, and what about subsidies?
Subsidies are the opposite. They're meant to encourage consumption.
Like the EV grants.
Exactly.
Okay, and then we have price ceilings and price floors.
Right. Those are limits on how high or low a price can be.
Right. Okay, and lastly, we talked about government failure,
Yeah, that's when the government's intervention makes things worse.
like with the rent control in Berlin.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. I think we're all on the same page now.
Great.
Before we move on to the next part, I just want to touch on one more thing.
Sure.
We talked about how the government gets money from indirect taxes.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick example of how they actually calculate that?
Sure. Let's say the tax is £2 per unit
Okay.
and they sell 5,000 units. They would just multiply those two numbers.
So 2 pounds times 5,000 units equals 10,000 pounds.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's a pretty simple calculation.
Yeah, it is.
All right, well, this has been a really interesting deep dive so far.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
We've seen how governments can intervene in the market, and we've seen how those interventions can have both good and bad consequences.
It's a complex issue.
It is, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot more to explore.
So join us for part 2 of this deep dive.
Yeah, we're going to look at some real-world examples.
It's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, there.
Okay, so let's get into some real-world examples of these government interventions.
Yeah, let's see how this stuff actually plays out.
Okay, so we talked about the UK sugar tax.
Uh-huh.
Did that actually change what people were drinking?
It seems like it did.
Really?
Yeah, there were studies that showed people drinking less sugary drinks.
Wow, so it wasn't just a temporary thing.
It seems like the trend is continuing.
That's impressive. What about the companies making those drinks? Did they change anything?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of them reformulated their drinks.
To have less sugar?
Exactly, probably to avoid those higher taxes.
So the tax kind of pushed them to make healthier drinks.
Yeah, you could say that.
And I wonder if it also led to more new drinks, like,
Yeah.
low sugar options and stuff.
Yeah, that's possible, I mean.
Did they get more innovative because of the tax?
Yeah, maybe. It's hard to say for sure, but it's something to think about.
Okay, cool. All right, let's talk about subsidies now.
Okay.
We talked about the UK EV grant scheme for electric cars.
Mm-hmm.
Did those grants actually help reduce emissions?
Well, electric car sales have been going up.
Yeah.
So the grants probably helped with that.
But it's hard to say for sure, right?
Yeah, there are other factors too, like
Yeah.
better batteries,
Right.
and people are more aware of the environment now.
Okay, but I wonder if the grants also had like
Yeah.
a knock-on effect. you know? Like, did it encourage more investment in charging stations and stuff?
Yeah, probably. I mean, if more people are buying electric cars,
Yeah.
companies are going to want to invest in that whole ecosystem.
Right. Okay, so it's like
Yeah,
one thing leads to another.
exactly.
Okay, let's move on to price controls.
Okay.
We talked about rent control in Berlin, which didn't work so well.
Yeah, that's a good example of what not to do.
Right, but are there any examples of price controls actually working?
Well, they can work in certain situations.
Like what?
Well, like during emergencies,
Oh,
when
right.
there's a sudden shortage of something,
Right.
like after a natural disaster, the
Okay.
government might set price controls on things like food and water.
So people don't get ripped off.
Exactly. Yeah.
But what about in the long term?
It's harder to find examples of price controls working well over a long period.
Really?
Yeah, but some people argue that utility regulation
Okay.
can be seen as a kind of price control,
Okay.
like with electricity and water, to prevent those companies from charging too much.
So it's like a way to keep prices fair.
Yeah, but it's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
You don't want to stifle innovation.
Right. Okay, what about minimum prices?
Uh-huh.
We talked about Scotland's minimum price for alcohol.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay.
Some studies show that people did drink less.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, and there were fewer alcohol-related hospital visits.
So it had some positive effects.
Yeah, but there are also some concerns.
Like what?
Well, some people might have switched to other substances.
Oh, like drugs.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay. And also,
Yeah.
it could hit poorer people harder. Right.
Yeah, because they're more sensitive to price increases.
Right. Okay. So it's a complicated issue.
Yeah, it's tough to find the right balance.
Okay. Let's talk about state provision.
Okay.
Like the NHS, are there other examples of that around the world?
Yeah, a lot of countries have universal healthcare systems.
Like where?
Well, Canada has Medicare, and Australia has Medicare too.
Oh, they both call it Medicare.
Yeah, it can be confusing.
Okay. And those systems are all about making sure everyone has access to healthcare,
Exactly.
regardless of their income.
Uh-huh.
But those systems must be really expensive to run
Yeah, they are, but they've been pretty successful.
in terms of providing healthcare to everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. What about other areas where the government provides stuff directly?
Well, education's another big one.
Right. Like public schools.
Exactly.
And a lot of countries even have free university.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing.
It is, but there are challenges there too, right?
Oh, yeah, like ensuring quality
Okay.
and making sure everyone has equal opportunities.
Right. Okay. So state provision can be a good thing,
Yeah.
but it's not always easy.
No, it's complicated.
Okay. Let's move on to regulation.
Okay.
We talked about smoking bans and environmental regulations. Can you give us some more examples?
Sure. Well, regulations can cover a lot of things,
Okay.
like product safety,
All right.
consumer protection,
Right.
financial markets,
Right.
pretty much anything the government wants to control.
So it's like setting the rules of the game for the market.
Exactly.
But how do those regulations actually get made?
Well, it's a long process.
Okay.
Usually it involves government agencies,
Uh-huh.
industry experts,
Okay.
consumer groups, sometimes even scientists.
Wow. So it's a lot of people coming together.
Yeah, it's a collaborative effort.
Okay. And then once the regulations are made, how do they make sure people follow them?
Yeah, enforcement is key.
Right.
They need to monitor companies,
Yeah.
do inspections, sometimes impose fines.
Okay. So it's not just about making the rules.
Yeah, you got to make sure people actually follow them.
Okay. Let's go back to those tradable pollution permits for a minute.
Okay.
Can you give me some more examples of how those are being used?
Sure, the EU emissions trading scheme is a big one.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of that.
Yeah, it covers a lot of different industries.
And it's all about reducing greenhouse gases. Okay. Are there other examples like that?
Yeah, China has one.
Okay.
And California has one too.
Really?
Yeah, and there's talk of a global carbon market.
Wow. So it's a global trend.
It seems to be, yeah.
But there must be challenges with these schemes, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like what?
Well, like how do you set the initial cap on emissions?
Right. That seems tricky.
Yeah, if it's too high, it won't be effective.
And if it's too low, it could hurt the economy.
Exactly.
Okay. What about distributing the permits fairly?
Yeah, that's important too.
Some companies shouldn't get an advantage.
Right, there are different ways to do it.
Like what?
Well, some schemes auction them off.
Okay.
Others give them away for free based on past emissions.
Okay. So there's no one right way to do it.
It depends on the situation.
Okay. This is all really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
My brain is starting to hurt a little bit.
I hear you. It's a lot of information.
How about we take a break here
Yeah, good idea.
and come back for the final part of our deep dive?
Okay,
We can wrap things up and
Yeah.
talk about what it all means.
sounds good.
All right, we're back and ready to wrap up this deep dive into government intervention. We've covered a lot of ground going through all those different ways governments get involved in the market, like taxes, subsidies, price controls, and even those pollution permits.
Right, a whole toolbox.
Yeah, and we've seen how those interventions can have both good and bad consequences, like sometimes they help and sometimes they backfire.
It's a balancing act.
It is. So as we wrap up, what are the key takeaways here? What do we really need to remember about this whole government intervention thing?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no one right answer. There's no magic solution that works every time.
So what works in one situation might not work in another.
Exactly.
Okay? And even if the government has good intentions, things can still go wrong.
Yeah, unintended consequences.
Right. So it's all about choosing the right tool for the job
And understanding the context.
and being aware of the potential downsides. Okay. What else?
Well, it's important to keep evaluating and adapting, Like, you can't just put a policy in place and forget about it.
Oh, so you need to keep checking to see if it's working.
Yeah, and be willing to change things if it's not.
So it's like a constant process of learning and adjusting.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But how can we as everyday people
Yeah,
make sense of all this and form our own opinions about when the government should intervene?
that's a good question, and I think this deep dive has given us some tools to think about it.
Like what?
Well, first of all, we need to ask ourselves, what's the problem?
Okay.
Is there actually a market failure?
Right. Is the market not working the way it should?
Exactly, and then we need to ask, what will happen if we do nothing?
Okay, so you really need to understand the problem before you start talking about solutions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, what else?
Well, once you understand the problem,
Mm-hmm.
you need to look at the different options for intervention
Okay.
and think about the costs and benefits of each one.
So what are the trade-offs?
Exactly.
Okay, and we also need to remember about those unintended consequences
Right, this can be tricky.
and think about how different groups will be affected.
Yeah, you got to think about the big picture.
Okay, so it's about thinking things through carefully
Yeah, and not jumping to conclusions.
and demanding evidence.
Right, holding our policymakers accountable.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
I think I'm starting to get it.
Good.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how complicated this all is.
It is complicated.
But it's also really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I feel like I understand the world a little bit better now.
That's great to hear.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else you want our listeners to remember?
Well, if I had to boil it all down to one thing,
Okay.
it would be this. Be curious, be skeptical, be engaged.
Break that down for me.
Well, be curious about how the world works.
Okay.
Be skeptical of easy answers.
Right. Don't just believe everything you hear.
Exactly. And be engaged in the conversation.
So participate in the debate.
Yeah, make your voice heard.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
Be curious, be skeptical, be engaged.
It's good advice for life in general.
It is. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive.
Uh-huh.
We've explored the world of government intervention in the market.
We've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly.
We have, but hopefully we've all come out of it a little bit smarter.
I think so.
So keep those brains buzzing.
Keep asking questions.
And remember, economics is everywhere.
It's all around us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.